Okay, so we're here. Thank you guys again. This is weird. I'm nervous, but I have the lovely Laura with me, and Laura's gonna introduce me, I guess, for those of you who don't know me, and then we will go from there. All right, Laura.
Yes. All right. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you all know Chloe or at least read her amazing book. So Chloe and I met as graduate students at Penn State in the English BAMA program, which is an integrated bachelor and master's degree in English and creative writing. Chloe also has a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism and has completed internships at Upright Citizens Brigade and Comedy Central. She was one of the first authors to have her short stories published on campus through Short Edition, which is a short story dispenser. And she has also been published in Please See Me, Tinge, Calliope, Clio, and her writing catalog includes numerous other publications and awards. So that's Chloe on paper and all of the amazing things that she's done. But on a more personal level, Chloe was the person in every creative writing class and workshop who would break those long, awkward silences that follow the question, and what did we like about this story? If you've ever been in a creative writing workshop, you probably have felt that anxiety. But after that, she'd give a thoughtful and intelligent response about aspects of her story that you hadn't even considered were working. And the rest of us would look around each other like, whoa, how do we follow that? And when everyone would get comments back on their stories, Chloe was usually known for, in purple or pink ink, she would write positive comments on what was working or giving helpful suggestions for how certain sections might be revised, which was awesome. But prior to reading her book, Chloe was someone that I thought of as being meticulous in a way that translated to helping those around her. She was the first person that I would ask for new teaching ideas when we were graduate teaching assistants together. Because I knew that Chloe had already considered every possible question that these 18-year-olds might ask about the Burkean parlor metaphor. And something that is often ignored, especially during the college years when the pressure is on to do as much as possible through various internships, is that this actual woman behind the responsible go-getter that we all know and love. So before we get into the Q&A section of today's virtual launch, for Perf, which was published through New Degree Press in August, so last month. Chloe's actually going to read a few passages for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Chloe to read for us.
Thank you. Very sweet, very kind. Laura has her own book coming out also through New Degree Press, which I'm very excited about. But Laura's always been a big supporter even after school and figuring out like what the heck does a writer look like at 22 in a pandemic, post-grad, etc. And she's always been the biggest supporter, one of the early readers of this book. So in part, this book is good thanks to her. I'm nervous. Okay, anyway. We're gonna start. I think so. I picked a snippet from each part. So the first part, I'm gonna read the first chapter. And this first chapter is a pop quiz because I think it's the best way to enter into the first part, which is, for me, it was like redefining perfectionism and sort of looking at the nuances of it based on actual research and figuring out that it's not just what I assumed it always was, which was just this idea of, sorry, I'm also letting people in. I'm also the bouncer of my own party, but also just like in this first part, redefining it. So it's not just like, oh, perfectionism is this great, beautiful aspect. This is what makes people great. This is what keeps people pushing themselves further and further and further. It's also this idea of like, oh, there's all these negative consequences. So this first chapter was, I guess, like me formulating my own research and looking around that and trying to bring in other people to show that, like, more or less this perfectionism is not like, oh, one person can be a perfectionist. We sort of live in a very perfectionist atmosphere in 2021. And for like decades now that we haven't really acknowledged. So without further ado, chapter 1. Chapter 1, the pop quiz. Does looking at a multiple choice structure in an outline give you hives? Do you have slight PTSD from the SAT or GRE or the Terra-Nova tests you took back in 3rd grade? Then you're the ideal contestant for What Kind of Perfectionist Are You? My version of a BuzzFeed quiz that simultaneously feels like a Myers-Briggs test and an SAT Scantron all in one. So get anxious and tense because that's the way to take this one. Woo! Are you a perfectionist? 1, yes. 2, absolutely not. 3, I've never thought about it before, but it could be likely. I'll let you peek at the answers on this one. The correct answer is 1, yes. Are you feeling sort of off that I asked your opinion, then discarded it? A, yes. Nah, B, nah, I'm cool, but like, don't do it again. C, I'm confused by the layout of this information. D, I'm here to have an open mind. E, I hate this. Cool, got it. Won't throw you for an emotional loop like that again. But here's the thing, we live in a perfectionist society. Perfectionism manifests individually, but it results from varying societal factors. If your parents wanted you to be the best to make you a wonderful future for yourself, you might have worried you had to get good grades or behave correctly in public to appease them. That one-on-one relationship has apparent cause and effect on how perfectionism can become contagious in human dynamics. A single perfectionist can influence a space, and a perfectionist space can create a perfectionist individual. For example, that perfectionist parent goes to work. They also want their employees to be the best and require flawless work. The stakes appear high because a mistake can translate into dollars or client satisfaction. You can't shrug off mistakes. We must eradicate them to keep things at baseline production. Employees fear mistakes from themselves or others and shame anything sloppy or accidental. It has a trickle-down effect. A boss calls out the flaws of their subordinate, who calls out the flaws of their assistant, until everyone is slightly paranoid. What number mistake will it be until they lose the job entirely? Discovering that answer is not as cute as that owl who says, let's find out about the licks to the center of a Tootsie Pop, though the workplace may be just as impatient. Likewise, let's go back to that student who has the perfectionist parent. It's clear why the one-on-one influence of a parent to child would have yielded a mini perfectionist. The parent wants the kid to go to the best college, to have the best career prospects, but the student's friends have that same pressure despite different familial dynamics. These kids have grown up believing if they don't go to college, they won't be successful. The kids are just as scared as their parents about the future. As college acceptances become expected for most, students have to think about how they can be perfect on paper, or at least better than their friends. A bad test could cause tears and catastrophizing that makes the student think they will never get into any college. Those with less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds are expected to work twice or 3 times as hard to keep up because the expectation of a perfect resume and report card remains the same. This pressure comes from parents and peers because of the culture we live in. If failure happens, it has to be optimized into a teaching moment that advances the even bigger future success. We live in a mistake-averse zone, and it's contagious. As far as we know, a mistake could cost us a job, financial security, relationships, everything. Most institutions, from workplaces to education, worry about becoming the best in a hyper-competitive capitalist field. Odds are you are probably a perfectionist by virtue of being alive in perfectionist spaces in 2021, at least in some parts of your life. Do I still have your attention, or are you still mad that I called you a perfectionist? A, you don't have to judge me like that. B, as individuals, we all have control of our own lives. C, my perfectionism is actually the reason for all my success. D, I'm just like not a perfectionist. E, classic lib millennial blaming society. F, I could never be mad at you for expanding my horizons. Okay, I hear you. I felt the same way whenever someone told me I was working too hard or being too harsh on myself, minus the lib dig. My conversations had never expanded to the societal level because this was a trait I liked about myself. I enjoyed being right that my perfectionism was the right tactic for me. I didn't like someone else talking down to me as if I had broccoli in my teeth my entire life and they were doing me a favor by pointing it out. My broccoli was part of my charm. I knew it was there the whole time, but you didn't have to make me feel like it was gross. Don't you dare come near me with the flaws. In college, my verbal self-criticism induced my then boyfriend to gift me a book from the checkout section of Urban Outfitters entitled, Be Happy. Out of denial, I never opened the book. Though he wanted to show that he saw me and my depressive symptoms, my constant concerns about being fat or ugly, my stress about my straight A's or extracurriculars, I resented him for thinking something was wrong with me. The book sits somewhere in my parents' basement, suffocating between dusty textbooks. We tell ourselves perfectionism is our superpower, so if we release our grasp on it, we believe we will become lazy, boring, unmotivated, ordinary. The ground under our feet shakes and we don't know where we stand anymore. Still not sold on this whole perfectionism culture is bad and we are all perfectionist things? A, no. B, learning is the next great adventure. Okay then, Do you experience any of the following? A, you think in all or nothing, black or white, always or never terms. B, you motivate yourself or others through fear. C, you focus on results over process. D, you fear failure. E, you procrastinate. F, you act defensive. I would argue you might have been a little defensive before, back when I told you might have been a perfectionist, and some of you called me a lib millennial. I know I write the options, but some of you chose it. Anyway, back in January 2020, when I had a job and commuted into an office, I browsed James Madison University's website for counseling options. My brother Colin was drowning in midterms, and he texted my family that he had barely eaten or slept and was starting to go old-fashioned mad. Being the person I am, a doctor's daughter and there's a specialist for that believer, I jumped to prescribing a specialist for that. While searching JMU's counseling site under the martyrdom of helping Colin, who did not ask for this help, I found a flyer for a JMU clinic called Reset Perfectionism. Do you, it asked, experience intense anxiety, distress, self-criticism if you make a mistake or do not get a perfect grade? Feel like what you accomplish is never quite good enough? Procrastinate on assignments because they just have to be right? Feel less than others if you do not give more than 100% on everything you do? Often feel pressured to meet expectations others have for you? Or overcommit yourself because you struggle to say no, fear letting others down, or feel guilty when you have free time? I paused and looked over my shoulder to make sure my boss didn't see me reading this like it was a psychological porno. I reviewed the list again and mentally checked each symptom. I had never seen perfectionism defined in simple bullet points or listed for its flaws. But tell me who is not doing this. Is this not how people get things done? I thought. Is this just suggesting that this is another thing I have to fix about myself? Damn it. That should be another symptom. Evaluate everything in life, from books to breakfast to virtual errands to the elusive fun, on an invisible to-do list. The flawlessness search cannot exist without a long checklist of possible solutions for a longer list of flaws. I need a break. That's a lot of reading. Thank you, Catherine Yanazelli, for the muted applause. How lovely. All right. So part 2 is in this first section, I'm unpacking, I'm sort of looking at perfectionism in terms of what it means psychologically, how it ties into an American identity through Hamilton, or how we see it in terms of success, especially creative success now, in terms of Billie Eilish, my girls. She did not respond to requests for interviews, but someday it will maybe happen. So part 2 is me sort of looking at the things in my life that I really like with this perfectionist lens, why did I personally like them, or how does perfectionism latently hide in it. So there's some chapters where I'm looking at reality cooking TV shows where people are not only make a mistake and you're eliminated, but also trolled to their faces for any mistake that they might make, and how that relates to our fear of making mistakes now, especially in terms of a Twitter world where you can be openly trolled for anything. I also talk about cooking and what that unpacks, and why I've always sort of worried about being the woman that cooks, and all of these different emotional layers to that. But the one I want to read to you is actually about females in stand-up comedy. As Laura mentioned, I've done comedy internships, so I personally enjoy watching comedy, and I've watched a lot of other people do it, which therefore I think gives me a license, whether that's true or not, to have very loud opinions about it. So but I was watching all of these comedy shows within this, it was 2018 that I was doing these internships, and watching a lot of female comedians, specifically stand-up comedians, get up and they would talk a lot about sex. And I think maybe that blame Catholic school or bring whatever, but I was we don't have to do this. This is a lot. So anyway, this is me unpacking why this keeps happening, or why this is such a prominent thing in stand-up comedy for women, but also why do I care? So this next chapter is called The Funny Girls. It is chapter 7. Clarissa Mikowski accidentally opened for Jim Gaffigan in February 2020. She didn't know he was in the wings. She didn't even know an A-list comedian was going to be at the same venue. All she knew was she had her own 5 minutes to perform. At Gotham Comedy Club in Manhattan, the audience disappeared into the navy darkness as the lights trained on her. Waiters moved between tables, audience members bit into popcorn shrimp or clinked their beer bottles on tabletops. Otherwise, it was Claire's stage. She was still new to stand-up comedy, but here she was at a famed venue with framed photographs of a young Jerry Seinfeld, Ellen DeGeneres, and Eddie Murphy greeting guests. Only 2 months earlier, she had completed a 2-week stand-up crash course at Gotham, and the booker pulled her on for a 7 p.m. show. Most of the other performers were also, or based on the pauses for laughter or heavy self-deprecation, seemed new to comedy. One girl joked about being a total freak, but only when it came to making out with strangers at bars. My friends over there are laughing because they know it's true, she said mid-setup. At this Wednesday show, the audience responses came from regions of the rooms as a table of dedicated friends laughed generously while the rest of the audience would not. Claire stood on stage wearing black clothes and red lipstick and performed her set. She talked about a date with a guy who considered himself a reader because he reads work emails all day. When I went to the bathroom, I Amazon Prime took on phonics to his apartment, Claire joked. Her opinion changed when she found out he lived next door to singer Norah Jones. I don't care how stupid you are, I'm not going to pass up the opportunity to have Norah Jones serenade me from her living room window while I fuck this guy. I imagined after we'd finished, she would break into her Grammy Award-winning song, Come Away With Me, she told the audience. The truth was, Claire revealed to the audience, she didn't come away with Norah Jones. She came a little Baby Yoda orgasm during sex with her lackluster date by imagining the Popeyes down his street and their new chicken sandwich. I've never even had the sandwich, but just thinking about what it might taste like got me to the finish line faster than my sexual partner did, she said. The audience laughed not in polarized regions of obligatory friendship, but as one room. As she walked off her set, this wild applause at her back, the host reminded everyone they weren't allowed to pull out their phones and welcomed to the stage a translucently pale Jim Gaffigan, the real deal. Since Jim Gaffigan's sets never crossed beyond a family-friendly rating, his material might have been about zoos. However, it took a young woman joking about her mediocre sex life to warm up, or dare I say, lubricate the stage for him to come up unannounced and practice new, clean material. As someone sitting in the show, I was stunned and happy for Claire. And yet, there was a part of me that thought, sex jokes, really? Claire is too smart to make sex jokes like all the other female comedians. 8 months later in quarantine, with live comedy being a distant dream, I asked Claire about this night. I'm wondering whether she hates the trope of women performing sex jokes or not. If people think that female comedians only perform and write raunchy material, what is the responsibility of a female comedian? Wouldn't it be to not perform the material and shoot for elevated stuff to show the male haters? I struggle doing those kind of jokes because I'm like, am I reinforcing a negative pigeonhole for us? Claire said. But then by not doing it, I'm denying my own experiences and my own creativity because those are a lot of the jokes that come naturally to me. After our interview, she planned on showering and seeing someone who she had texted before quarantine. Whatever this date turned into, she already had her mind perked to mind jokes. If we do hook up tonight, I have jokes to do for my mic tomorrow, like, oh, I came out of retirement. It's just funny, you know? Yeah, I'm gonna stop there for that one. But yeah, I think that one, as much as Claire, who was my carpool driver in high school, for a little behind the scenes knowledge for you all, I think it was just like interesting to back into that and look at like people in my life and get interviews, but also like the more that I gradually dug into that specific essay, I was looking at like how Netflix promotes certain female comedians and what are the titles behind the series that they're putting up, like Nikki Glazer's like Bangin', or London Hughes has a special called like to Catch a Dick. I'm pretty sure you can read the book, you'll figure it out, it's in the titles. But yeah, I think, and then more and more as I unpack it, it becomes more of a question of like, well, why do I care? Like maybe this is just people getting up there, people saying what feels real to them, and why do I feel like I need to police that? And then gradually by the end, again, you'll have to read the book to get the juicy details, but I've done stand-up comedy 3 times in my life. Not to flex on you guys, but and that like in those bits, it is easier to gravitate towards the things that you know, and I did do sex jokes myself, but I think there is also there's components to my own identity where I was like resistant to like so much sex positivity because I didn't feel that way myself, and probably frankly still don't. Like I will work that out maybe in another book, but that's that chapter. So that's like a sampling of part 2. Fun stuff. Okay, so part 1 we're redefining, part 2 we're sort of applying perfectionism, and part 3 is like I'm unpacking it for myself in my own life, I have a chapter about my high school. I have a chapter sort of about these comedy internships and this belief that you have to like pay your dues and like sometimes physically pay for improv classes to feel like you're advancing anywhere at all. Or sort of expecting that like transactionally, if you put the time in, you're automatically assumed to get success and what that entitlement looks like in a creative field specifically. So all of those like hit a little bit more personally. And I was talking to Laura about this earlier, and the last chapter, which is also the conclusion, steps away from sort of more of an essay format to mirror like a case study. And in that sense, breaks away the same way that the first chapter does in becoming a pop quiz. And this one sort of looks at myself because I think it's very easy to look at a person as a resume and say, like, this is, oh, like if this person claims to be a perfectionist, there's probably a paradox there where it's like, oh, like, I mean, I don't like, excuse me if this comes off like cocky or weird, but it's like, oh, this girl claims she's a perfectionist and it's destroying her, but she also published a book on it, right? So it's like, wow, that like she still managed to be successful in some sort of way. But I wanted to give something that's more like insight into what the mindset is and how it hurts. Like it's not like, oh, all fun and games and like you just sort of bite your cuticles and endure the stress and get to where you want to go. It's a much more like stressful component. And in writing this book, I figured out stuff about myself that also in unpacking like, who am I, or who have I always tried to be, and being a perfect person, like aspects of my, and like even in the last chapter, as we discussed, like aspects of my own sexuality came to the surface. So yeah, I think my parents and my grandparents are on this chat. So let's cruise. Let's do it. This is the last chapter. This is the commonplace case of Chloe Cullen. 1 second. Abstract. This case study outlines the perfectionism listed in patient Chloe Cullen. She recognizes her perfectionist tendencies and past experiences, yet cannot prevent herself from repeating them in the present moment. This conflict between her reality and expectations creates a disorientation of her perceived reality. She seeks to improve her current state by undergoing close objective scrutiny as a case study subject. And then as one would in a medical chart, I imagine, I don't actually, well, let's say I do know. I definitely know this 100% for certain. I outline what I was feeling by months to see sort of the progression of things. So November 2020, patient presents with anxiety symptoms. Her days are heavy with negative thoughts like wearing damp clothes. She writes yet is stressed about the inconsistent habit. She starts virtual therapy. Therapists suggest that the patient's anxiety wouldn't exist if she just wrote instead of feeling anxious about it. The patient takes the suggestion and becomes more anxious. The therapist assigns homework tasks of to-do lists. The patient does not do the homework despite her repeated love of lists because the tightness of stress doesn't go away, and the to-do list is one more thing on her generalized to-do list. Patient switches therapists. Patient has recently moved back to New York apartment. She lived at her parents' house from March to June, then lived with her grandmother from June to Labor Day. Her significant other recently moved to Manhattan. She has visited him 2 or 3 times in the 5-month span due to COVID exposure risks. Before this, their relationship was long distance from December 2017 to October 2019. She talks about, quote, the honeymoon period, end quote, and reflects nostalgically about their first months, the Christmas cafe, the FaceTimes across time zones. The patient and her SO met before her Hollywood internship. In the 2 weeks before she left for LA, they met each other's friends and family. They spent 5 days straight together. They celebrated New Year's. She floated. She had never felt that way, itching to see someone and be comfortable with them. On their last day together before she left, they sat in his car parked under the 30th Street Bridge to wait for her bus. He bought her ticket, the first seat on the double-decker. It could feel like flying, he thought. Before they were bantering and joking, but as they turned toward the bus stop, she summarized Casablanca for him and said they would always have Paris, this moment, this feeling, and whatever happened to them. He said that he believed in the butterfly effect. When she got out of the car to board the bus, he looked at her and cursed like someone punched him in the ribs and kissed her one last time. Patient worries about moving in together and losing her independence in a new setting. She never volunteers her thoughts on restaurant selections. She never volunteers TV shows and suggests whatever she thinks he wants to watch. She starts to resent that he doesn't push more. He brings her laptop to his apartment and works from his bed most weekdays. She plays with his cats. She kills time. She tells her SO that she wants to write, and he tells her that he will give her whatever privacy, room, and time to do so. Still, she doesn't write. It brings her an everyday itchiness of determining when she will write until the act of writing itself in the abstract does not seem like a relief, but a fear. She doesn't write. She tells herself that something is wrong with her endurance, her discipline. She conflates her negative relationship with writing with her affirmation of her SO, how easily she chooses to do nothing with him. She could waste all of her days like this. She tongues the phrase, waste all of her days like a marble, but the tightness is there, and she wonders if the problem isn't her, but him. We're skipping ahead to February 2021. People talk conversationally about the patient's book to tell her they're proud of her. She hasn't written a thing between Thanksgiving and the end of January. Her motivation is diluted. On a bus ride home after the funeral of her friend's mother, she cries out a bus window. She listens to sad girl albums and realizes people might love her. The book creates a spell. People become more solid. It's always been about the people, she thinks. In therapy, the new therapist always asks how she feels about moving with her SO that week. The patient diagnoses herself with the fear of commitment. She never had a fear of commitment before. She had been in one long-term relationship or another since she was 16. The patient fears domesticity, adulthood, boredom. She thinks but does not say, one day I will wake up and be a suburban mom in an apron cutting flower stems and my life will be normal and it will be worth nothing. She imagines there has to be something more. She imagines every day that the door she wants open closes a little bit every day, no matter how quickly she runs to catch it with the toe of her shoe. She doesn't even know where the door is. She doesn't even know what the door leads to. The act of catching it, however, suggests a freedom, and wouldn't that be enough? The SO takes a ski trip to a different coast. The patient debates dyeing her hair purple as a living moral to her story. The remedy is to stop caring what people think of you, so you wear what you want in spite of other people. She tells herself this will be the weekend she dyes her hair. It isn't. This is the weekend of the long car ride. She and her roommates get into a lift to go to a friend's apartment. She thinks about the book and the conclusion she thinks she has discovered about life. It's about the people, but who cares what people think of you? The patient sweats. She watches the city landscape, black on a navy sky. You think you have this all figured out, like you're above everyone else with this new secret of life, but you're a hypocrite. You're hiding from yourself. You stifle yourself every day. Purple hair won't change that. The patient's perfectionism called out something that the patient otherwise would ignore. You're a hypocrite. You're pretending that you can keep being the way you are so people will like you. You think you've solved it, but really you're a fake. You want to ignore the piece of you that might jeopardize your normalcy. The patient is confused. Why now? Why ever? Just shut up. Without a word on the radio or from her friends, her thoughts rage against her. You shut up. You're a hypocrite and a scam. You like girls. You've ignored it all these years. She doesn't know why then. She does not know that something about this thought has been shifting inside of her, a wasp flying into the walls of a glass jar. She doesn't know what else it could mean. Does she have to fix it or solve it or resolve it, revise it? They reach her friend's apartment. The patient gets out of the car. Her roommates were there the whole time, silent in their own thoughts. She says she had too much time to think in that lift, and then she dismisses it all. She talks about her friend's water speakers and eats Chick-fil-A. In these conversations, she talks to no one but herself. You like girls. You like girls. She goes home and writes in her journal. She goes on for 10 pages, listing the questions she has about who she is. To see it written down makes her feel that some of the thoughts are real. The bisexuality, the orgasm disorder, self-diagnosis in its earliest articulated form. It also makes her feel incredibly lonely because she doesn't know who she can tell this to. She's scared to tell her SO. She's scared this feels too big, too wide for them to figure out. This will create a ripple effect. This will change everything. She turns to her therapist, sends pictures of the pages because the therapist feels like the only relationship in a vacuum, someone who won't have opinions on anyone but her. That week, she speaks to her therapist in an emergency session. Her therapist suggests that this makes sense. The orgasm disorder might mean she's only attracted to women. It might mean she breaks up with her SO to explore. The patient breaks into tears. I feel like I'm going to blow up my life, she repeats. The therapist tells her that she can't love anyone if she can't love and accept herself. Her SO deserves better than this, she thinks. The session ends. The patient is in the work lounge of her apartment building with her head down on a table while strangers, her neighbors, work on other enclosed office spaces. She still has told no one in her life about this thing, this internal conversation. The patient sobs in the shower long enough that her roommate quietly asks if everything's okay. The patient says nothing. I wish that I could take this away. I wish I didn't have it. She sets about fixing herself back into the partner that she was, or the partner she thought she was, now that she sees herself as different, as a flight risk. She Googles a bisexual in a straight relationship and reads Reddit threads of couples who tried and couples who broke up. After a few days of crying in their small apartment, the patient comes out to her roommates. She tells them about the orgasm disorder, about how she physically cannot love herself. They treat her SO's love as fact. He loves you so much, he will be understanding. There must be something wrong with the patient. He loves her so much, he will be understanding. Would she give him the same love? Is there something doubly wrong with her, that her love isn't as absolute, that she even has these questions that might pull her away? Do you even love him? Why would you do this to him? Is this why you're scared of commitment? Is this why you worry about the butterflies? Oh my God. This is why I'm like, why did I record this? Ridiculous. Okay. I think I'm actually just gonna stop there. I mean, it works out okay. Like, we're all okay in the end, and Luke and his family are on the call. So, but essentially, like, yeah, I still like haven't come out to a lot of my family and friends, so this is very crazy. But essentially, like, I think I was very wrapped up in this idea, and Laura has questions and we'll go through it, but it's just, when you only think in like, it has to be one way or another, to live in that middle space makes you feel like there's something wrong. So like, I'm completely happy in the relationship, but if you can't be happy with yourself or like accept yourself, it's very hard to see how other people love you as well. Oh, Laura, how are you going to redeem this? Like, are you okay? Are you ready to like, oh my God, Laura, take it away, please.
I was actually going to say that I think that it is one thing to write something very intimate and to reveal it, to publish it, which is, by the way, very cool. But to be able to talk about it in front of your friends and family, the whole time I'm sitting here and I'm like, go Chloe, and like just the messages of support that everyone has been sending you throughout this, like, we are all here for you. And I do definitely want to ask you more questions about that. But to kind of use the structure that you use in your book that you were talking about, your 3 sections, I'm going to try to frame the Q&A around that same framework. So going back, this is just like a general question for you. And so I have so many questions for you that I had trouble narrowing it down.
I'm sure I couldn't even look at the chat, so like, you got it, Laura.
Okay.
Steer us home. Take us home.
So I will try not to be like overly effusive about how much I love this book, and I'll try to remain unbiased.
I mean, you can be effusive if you want. That's fine.
Yes. Feel like this is amazing. But yes, that is like genuinely how I feel. So if anybody else feels that way, we're like welcoming that energy today. But to everyone else that is here that tuned in, so I'll start out these questions, but the format is going to be very conversational. So at any point, if you have a question that comes up in the middle of something Chloe is saying, we will take your question. If you're not comfortable asking it with turning off your mic, you are welcome, again, to have your camera on to ask it yourself. Or if you're like, no, I don't want to do that, you're welcome to just message it and we'll throw it in the mix. So again, very informal. If you want to just sit back and hear Chloe's wonderful answers, you can do that too. So to start, generally thinking about your book, so in your introduction, I mentioned teaching the Burkean parlor metaphor to Penn State students. In case anyone besides Chloe, and I also see that Mike, one of our former classmates, is on the call, besides Chloe and Mike, is like, what the heck is the Burkean parlor metaphor? It is and I hope I'm going to do this justice, but again, like, Chloe and Mike, correct me if this is not a good description, but it was a metaphor essentially coined by Kenneth Burke, which states that when you're putting a new claim or argument out there in the world, it's necessary to consider the conversation of everyone else who's provided input on the subject. While
Laura, I may have lost you for a second audio-wise. I don't know if that's just me.
Sorry, my internet is a little unstable.
I can hear you now.
Okay, so should I repeat the parlor metaphor? Are we all good to, I can re-explain it in
From
similar.
the top, take it from the top.
So essentially the way that I at least always explained it to my students was like, you wouldn't enter a party and then just immediately like you walk in the room and you start talking about like weather when everybody else is like, we were already talking about ant colonies. Like, you know how you do at a party, like topics. But so what you want to do is you want to consider, like, you kind of enter the conversation, you listen to what's being said, you put your input in, and then you leave the party or the room is essentially what this metaphor is stating. So Chloe, in thinking about that, and something that you have taught and then also how to approach in your writing of this book, can you give us some insight on your research process for this and how your case studies of perfectionist culture culminated in a case study of your own perfectionism in the section that you just read?
Absolutely. So in thinking about like what is the academic conversation around perfectionism, a few of the people that I talk to who are like psychologists or therapists who specifically like see perfectionism or study perfectionism would talk to me and say there's frankly still even now not a lot of writing on this, or like especially when they were studying to become psychologists in the positions that they now have, perfectionism wasn't a topic that necessarily was covered. So when we think about like the Burkean parlor, or like what is like the conversation that I'm joining by hopping in, like it's still very quiet. I think that the pandemic has definitely brought this out, and especially having written this and talked about it, I think a lot of people send me more articles. So you can see that there is more of a prominence of discussing perfectionism as a net negative. But I also came into this book with a lot of random ideas that I then like hinged onto perfectionism. So like this Burkean parlor gets bigger all the time because we're talking about stand-up comedy, or I'm talking about Gordon Ramsay, or I'm talking about Hamilton, the musical at one point, and how that perfectionism is part of the American identity, and that's why Hamilton pops up. So there's a lot of there's just a lot of like discussion going around in a lot of other spheres, and so to bring it back around to perfectionism with all these different topics that still stand out to me in ways that are like personally appealing, it was like a very satisfying thing. And then it all culminates, like as I sort of said going into this, and I've talked about with Laura, is that like I may have had all these different ideas about like, oh, I think I want to write about Hamilton and perfectionism, or I think I want to write about like Billie Eilish and this idea of like an inky finger theory, like people who are naturally creative should just be creating all the time, and there's like no inertia, or there's no barrier to entry for people who are just like whizzes. So if you have any creative like block, it's because there's something wrong with you. And just sort of like unpacking all these things about like, and like I guess listening to all these voices in the room on all these different subjects, and especially about perfectionism, like even that bulletin from JMU that I read about in the first chapter, to be like, oh, these are not good things, just sort of helped unpack like perfectionism perhaps keeps us like limited to like a cookie cutter version, right? And so when you start to unpack like why was I doing this, you also start to see like how like, oh, this isn't good, like the perfectionism and like the pain of doing things like being in high school and like crying at midnight because I'm so stressed about the work I have to do tomorrow, and then like continuing to work until like 1 a.m. on like a Wednesday night. It's like that stress isn't like, oh, that's not the secret sauce, you know? So I think it just like helped unpack it a lot. Yeah. And there's like a lot of like obviously the mental turmoil aspect of it, like the physical symptoms. But also just being like, okay, like who would you be if you weren't trying to be perfect? Like if you didn't try to be like the grand sum of what everyone else is doing. I think that's a little bit rambly, but like, what do you think, Laura? Did that serve the Burkean parlor well?
I think so. I don't know about anybody else. That brought up a lot of like questions for me, just in terms of like, especially when you were saying like cookie cutter and this idea of perfection having a formula. And we were talking earlier about how like in your intro, I think you make a point to say like, this is not a self-help book. like I do not have the answers, which is funny because now we're like a Q&A and we're like specifically like the answer's Chloe. But in terms of just like thinking about it like that, like I think it is important to know that your addition to the conversation moves beyond just saying like, I have figured it out, so you can too. And I think there's a falsity to people claiming that they have figured something out when they haven't. And I think that's one of the greatest parts of your book is just like the authenticity and saying like, I haven't figured it out. You probably haven't either. Like we are in this together, and there is that community and that rapport. But in thinking about the academics, like moving from the Burkean parlor into just like the academics and our academic stressors. So I do have to say that the quiz structure of your first chapter, it did give me some stress that I have not felt since I left school.
You're welcome.
But I don't know if anybody else was feeling that like anxiety, but I think it was on purpose. But the final sentence of that chapter, though, I just want to repeat it here. So you said you have passed the quiz that we were all taking together. You passed the quiz, but you were always going to pass. And perhaps that's the lesson of it. You, as you are right now, pass without having to earn it. What do you hope your readers will gain from reading Perf, and thinking about to our earlier conversation that we had today about, again, this is not self-help, but thinking about self-help as a genre. I think we looked it up. We're like, this feels like a really old genre. And I think the first self-help like writing was from ancient Egypt from like 2800 BC or something like that. So in considering that this has a long history and considering that you've added to the conversation with your perspective, what do you want to be the biggest takeaway from people reading Perf?
Yeah, I think that is sort of the paradox, is that someone who is a perfectionist, there's like a power in awareness, right? And like recognizing what this is. And I hope that this gives the foundation for people to be like, objectively, these are the symptoms of perfectionism. But I don't have an objective like, and if you wake up at 6 a.m. and you meditate for 3 hours and then do your work and then like drink a juice, like you'll be cured and you'll be absolutely fine. Like a perfectionist wants to improve themselves to perfection. So ironically, someone will be like, okay, then how do I get rid of my perfectionism, right? Or like, how do I fix or resolve, or, which is like, I guess, repeating a line from that last chapter, but it's like, you have this urge to sort of like mend yourself into a perfect human being. And perfectionism, like from people I've talked to, is not something that you eradicate. Like it's not something that you just like erase for yourself. It's a lot of asking yourself the personal questions of like, what are the stressors for me? I hope that illuminates some of that on like a level of like, we're in a very hyper competitive time. We're in a generation where we have designated, like, if you're my age, like less wealth than before. So you're working harder and harder to get less wealth. And you're feeling like any risk you might have might make you lose that like little financial stability you've gained. So there are wider issues that might be like, okay, this is why I feel stressed about having to be the best at school, at work, at what have you. But also, I think like you have to ask yourself those questions of like where do these voices come from? Like, why do I keep telling myself no? Why do I feel that I have to be this definition of perfect? But yeah, I hope and trying to like do that work, like I can't do that work for you, but if you can like give yourself the break that like you're never going to get rid of perfectionism. It's like, even if you've like fully like processed like why it happens, like I still get waves of like, I need to be doing this right. Like I haven't figured it out now that I've written this book. And that's like very much okay. Like, because then being mad at yourself for being perfectionist, like will tip you back into that cycle. So I guess that's like the main takeaway, is that if people are coming into this because they are aware of their imperfectionism and walk out being like, oh, maybe this isn't good, maybe I do want to change, that's great. But don't try to Barbie doll yourself into like, okay, now I have no like perfectionism because I've fixed my mental health completely and I have no worries ever again, you know, because obviously that's
very concerning if somebody said that. You'd be like, wait, what?
Well, you never know. You know.
But no, I think you're definitely right in terms of a lot of times when people are reading these more formulaic answers, they're thinking like, oh, okay, somebody else has figured it out, so now I can apply that to my life. Whereas it sounds like what you're saying is more of like, you have to do the self-reflective work and then apply it yourself. Like it is,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, more subjective for an objective situation, an objective issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you do that and show other people how to do it through your book. And so with that note and that segue, we are moving into the more personal questions. So we are getting there. So I'm preparing you, Chloe, and I'm preparing everybody to
get ready.
You read about, or you're talking about like stand-up comedy, and then there's also another aspect in terms of how women are perceived through perfectionism that I want to touch on a little bit that I think is another major aspect of your book. So one theme that we see throughout all of these chapters is this idea of wanting, again, I've said this, but wanting a formula for living the perfect life without wanting to fit into a stereotype specifically of what a woman is supposed to be. And you mentioned Martha Stewart as an example, and this valuation that we place on the false perceivable of effortlessness. Could you talk a little bit more just about the pressure that women take on in crafting what we think either society or our partners wants us to be?
Right. I think an idea that I touch on a lot, maybe in other chapters, and maybe like coming into this book, is I had this idea that it's like I had to be like 1950s, like unapologetically helpful at all times, like especially as a woman, like not only like in romantic relationships, but basically all relationships I have is like, how can I help? What can I do? Like, especially like a perfectionist. If you're a perfectionist, it means that you're basing your definition of like perfect very heavily on like whatever is around you. It's a very relative shifting definition. And if someone like in the Burkean parlor, right? But like if you're in a room with 5 people and one of those people is like, what you said kind of like made me upset, or like, oh, you didn't go fill up my water bottle when you went to fill your own, and that made me annoyed, then the perfectionist is like, I must be a bad person because this one person, or whatever, versus being like, on an absolute level, I just did not know that you wanted that and was just grabbing my own water bottle. So in that sense, like a perfectionist will also like hyper overreact to be like, does anyone need anything? Does anyone, like, if I'm getting up, like, do I need to grab like 16 water bottles? Like, what does everyone need? So it's like, it's a very relative scale, which also means that like, not only from the people around you are you picking up like how to be perfect, like your friend with better skin, your friend who's funnier, your friend who's like whatever, what have you, you're like comparing yourself to all those, but you're also comparing yourself to everything in the media, obviously, like that's nothing new, your social media, your TV shows, whatever. And so I think we've all sort of consumed this idea that like an ideal relationship, or in order to like, I don't know where I consumed this, frankly, because it's like, it's TV, it's not really like reflective of like my own parents' relationship. It's just like, I think I, like as an oldest daughter and oldest sibling, whatever, felt like I always had to be taking care of the maternal of other people. So I felt like in a relationship, I always had to be the one that's taking care of somebody else, and therefore would not let other people take care of me. So there's like a whole chapter about domesticity where I'm like, I don't want to cook because I don't want to be like, oh, like Miss, like, I don't know, like Miss has to get home from her job to make sure that like someone's cooked, because like everyone's sitting and twiddling their thumbs being like, mom's the one that cooks, and obviously that's also a very like hetero or straight view of a relationship as well, where it's like, oh, mommy and daddy, and like daddy will work and mommy like makes dinner and does the laundry for all of us and knows where our shoes are, even though that is like, if both parents work, that is still expected of the mom. So yeah, I think it's unpacking a lot of that on a level, and like we have female stand-up comedians now like 2021. I'm like, have you guys heard about these female stand-up comedians? They're out there. Like, check it out. Anyway, but like also like relatively new in terms of the genre, like Joan Rivers is one of the first, Ellen DeGeneres was like the first person to really come out in like the 90s, and now we've had like since Amy Schumer in the last 10 years or so more of a surge, I would say. But it's like you still hold those expectations to like, okay, this is what a woman should be, like not too loud, like not too abrasive, should defer to other people if needed. So it's sort of like, yeah, I think I'm straying from the question. I tend to do this, but yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard to have those expectations for yourself, right? Like, and to assume everyone else has those expectations, especially when you're a perfectionist and you're like relative, to be like, I don't want anyone to think terribly of me because therefore I am a bad person. So you're hyper overreacting to be like, I have to be quiet, I have to be well behaved, I have to make the dinner, because like, what if I don't make the dinner and then my partner is like, well, like I'm out, you know, which like you can come up with these stories in your head about what will happen and like who you will lose. And I think that's like the real threat of it, you know. And I also want to, as I'm reading these things like in snippets, I'm like, shoot, I hope that nobody is like, oh, Miss Anti-Stay-at-Home Mom. It's like, no, I'm not like, and I think that comes around also in reading the chapters in the book in full, is that it's not necessarily that I'm like I'm anti-domesticity necessarily. It's just like the expectations to put on myself to be like, oh, you have to be this way, versus like, okay, like I have since talked to the dear Luke Pinto, and he's like, I don't want you to be a stay-at-home mom unless you want to be a stay-at-home mom. I know you want to work, like you should do what makes you happy. And that should be first and foremost in the conversation, versus like expecting that you are like, oh, like, well, I'm gonna hit 30, so gotta retire early and like go make some bacon, you know, whatever. See, Livy. Okay.
Yeah, and I think you really get to the heart of like why perfectionism can never really be obtained, that it's always in the eyes of others and our perceivable of how others view us, which it's like we're not mind readers. So you can never like fully achieve that because you're constantly just looking around thinking like, what does this person think of me? What does this person think? And that like that sense of a loss of identity, I think is something that really comes through in your book. And like that fear of domesticity is like kind of playing off of that, of like not wanting to lose yourself, not wanting to lose who you really are. I also think it's kind of funny that you're like, I'm straying from the question, but you actually like segued like beautifully into the next question.
Oh my God, I'm so good at this.
Oh, it's like we planned that. We did not plan that, but like that worked out well. So I appreciate that.
Oh my gosh, awesome. We're so good. Cool.
Yes. So we only have about 4 minutes left of our original like allotted time, but I'm going to ask Chloe another question. And again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to just stay on. We're going to keep talking for a little bit longer, past 8. So if you want to hang in with us, like welcome, we'll keep going. So in the last chapter, which you read a couple sections of that for us. So you have this case study. So this is categorized by the organization of symptoms. So you talk about work, school, and image-related stressors. Later, you discuss the turmoil of coming to terms with your sexuality in the section that you read for us, while in a long-term heterosexual relationship. In italicized asides, you state you're a hypocrite, you're pretending you can keep being the way you are so people will still like you. You think you've solved it, but you're really a fake. You want to ignore the piece of you that might jeopardize your normalcy. And later, again, in the section you read for us, you say you like girls, you've ignored it all these years, and repeat that. So this is something that Chloe and I have discussed before. So about the perils of realizing you are a bisexual woman while in a long-term relationship with a man. So this comes with a lot of different struggles. We're not going to touch on all of them today, but including the ones that Chloe discusses in her books, but wondering if you should break up to explore this aspect of your identity, biphobia and bi erasure just from the LGBT community itself. And then this choice between the stasis of a culturally like acceptable relationship with a man, and then navigating the unfamiliarity of choosing to date a woman.
Oh, lost your audio a little bit again, Laura. I'm looking at Nora Dolan's name right now.
again, but I will repeat the question.
I lost you at bi erasure, which, like, by the way, makes me sound like very, very knowledgeable. Very.
Yeah. What a point to end on. Just bi erasure disappears.
Like, yes. Let's chat.
So bi erasure from the LGBT community and this biphobia from that as well. And then this choice between the stasis of a culturally like acceptable relationship with a man and then this unfamiliarity of choosing to date a woman, and how specifically this would affect the way that others see you. And so my question is just about, how did you come to terms with your sexual identity? And how did this affect the perfectionist structure, which you've already established both in the book and then also again today, that you'd already built up? Does that make sense? That's a very long question, so let me know if you need me to clarify any of that.
Well, let me take a whack at it, and you can reel me in if I babble, which I will. And just like take me back to the points if you see something coming up. But yeah, essentially, I think this realization was like realizing I was bi was sort of after like being in a 3-year relationship. Again, like it's sort of compounded with this idea that I was like, okay, we're in a 3-year relationship, like we're at this point, and we're like very serious about each other, but it's just like a question of what if, right? And that's not to say that I'm like, well, what if I am? It's like, no, I know that I am, but I think the hardest part about realizing that was like, well, what if I don't explore that? Am I like an illegitimate member of this community because I've only ever dated men? Am I not a member of the community? Am I like do I have to like date a woman? Like it's almost like a bucket list thing. And where I was like, well, do I have to date someone? And then like I'll date one woman and I'll be like, oh, I don't like dating women, you know, which also boils down every woman to be like, oh, one woman would be the same for all, you know? So I think it was like a lot of like, what should I do? It was a lot of questions, and like the anxiety came from such a place of like what I think legitimate is like a good word. It's like, what makes me legit? Like, am I not really gonna know? Like, what if like, again, like, and I said this sort of after the reading, but for someone like as a perfectionist, like in the initial chapter, like you like absolutes, you think in all or nothing, like you're either good or you're bad. Like to be in this space where it's like, oh, I like girls, it's like, oh, so then you're a lesbian, you know? And it's like, well, no, there's more rounds to it. But then it was like, well, what if you are? And then like you never know, and then you're like using Luke as a beard and whatever, and like all of a sudden it became this cognitive distortions that like maximized this issue, and also like fed into these negative thoughts of like, you are bad, like you are like a terrible person for realizing this about yourself, like you're selfish for doing so, in a straight relationship, because now like you have to drag someone along for the ride while you're figuring things out. And it is like entirely like, again, I didn't read these sections, so it's like you're gonna have to read it yourself. But essentially Luke was like, whatever you need to do, I'm here for you because I love you. And if that means like you end up like falling in love with and marrying a woman, like I love you enough to know that if that's what makes you happy, like I'm here for it. Which is like one of the most generous gifts, is that on top of this I wouldn't have to navigate like, oh my gosh, like I have to figure this out, but I also have to tiptoe around Luke again to like tell myself to be quiet or whatever. Like I could be myself with him and talk honestly with him, and he never once like was like, well, but like, what does this mean, you don't like me? It was just like, so anyway, I think there's a little bit of biphobia, right, where I was like, I'm not legit. Like if I've never even kissed a girl, like where does this put me? Like I can't really show up to the marches and be like, hey, whatever, and then like show up with my straight partner and people would be like, okay, like who brought like Karen to the march, you know what I mean? Like I don't know, but it's, yeah. So I think there was a lot of issues with that, but I think that, and also the book ends like in April, we're in September now. Like there's also been like a lot of growth since I had to like turn something in for revisions and like kick it in. And I'm like, this is the ending, you know, like, but I think I'm finally at a point where I'm like, why do I need to worry about like what I should be doing on behalf of the community, or like what I should be doing for someone else, when I'm like, I am very like centered and happy in my current relationship. And that doesn't mean I have to prove something to somebody else to be like, no, this is who I am. Like, so yeah, I mean, again, like, I'm not like a queer theorist by any means. Like I'm very straight culturally still. Like I'm just figuring this out about myself in the last, like, since February, the last 7 months or so. So I'm like figuring, like, I don't feel like I still have imposter syndrome about being like, oh, well, let me speak on behalf of like the LGBTQ community. You know, I can only speak for myself. But I think it did have to come down to a point where it's like, you can't worry about communities, even so on a larger scale. Again, that's perfectionism being like, well, how will I be accepted? It's like, no, I just have to choose what I need and like what makes me happy. No. So I guess that's a happy note.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, as far as your authority to speak on that, like, I think you do have that authority and that right. I mean, right now you are an author, which like comes, it's the root of like the word for authority.
So I can say anything.
You are an authority. You can say whatever you want to protect. You're expert. But in terms of just when you were talking about that, and I think the LGBT community in general is very focused on labels, or I guess just like sexuality in general is very focused on labels, but it brought me back to your first chapter in that quiz. And so this is a very difficult question on the spot that I did not get to answer, so I apologize. But as far as thinking back to the structure of that first chapter, if you were going to give like a quiz to yourself and have all these options saying like I'm straight, I'm gay, I'm bi, like having all these options, or just like it doesn't matter, like I am Chloe Cullen, like what would you say in terms of how has your framework for thinking about perfectionism in these absolutes that you mentioned in this structure of like there are 4 answers and you have to choose one? Like how can we move, or I guess now I'm getting back to like help us Chloe, but how like do you see yourself in the growth that you've done both through writing this book and then also since the book has been published? What direction do you see that going, and just in your own self-reflection?
Wow, I don't know. I think my mom said something to me when I came out to my parents, and I came out and I was just like, I was also going to them being like, help me, like, what is the answer? You guys are still together. Like, you must know, like boiling down being like, if you guys are together, you must have the answers to every relationship that's ever occurred, which is like also a very perfectionist thing where it's like, everyone else has the answers. Anyway, but I think my mom said to me, like, it's just not that deep. And I think that really does help, where it's like, I would be spending days like also like working and sending out emails like, oh, like this child has an audition for a role in a really bad movie. And I'm like, da, 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 I'm doing whatever pays the bills. And meanwhile being like rolling and rolling and rolling in my thoughts. And it's just like, okay, it's not that deep. Like you truly can just be like, okay, like, I think it was like, I was talking to so many people to be like, what are the answers? And people were just like breathe, like the consequences here, like you're making up very high stakes for yourself to come to a conclusion on a thought. And ultimately, like, those thoughts are important, but it was just like, it's just like trying to figure out the right way to phrase it. It's just like, things can be what they are right now, and there's no need to be like, no, but I need an answer out of it. Like, things need to be better. What if, whatever, like, things are what they are. It's just not that deep. So like who I am today is like a person on a Zoom call, sweating through my shirt, keeping people 10 minutes after the virtual launch that it would potentially end, and it's like, whatever, you guys can leave if you want, or you can stay, like, I'm not trying to be like, what does everyone need? And I don't know. I'm very rambly. We'll get back. I imagine I'll get better at this someday, but like, that's a very heavy question. I think I'm better now. I think I am like more like okay, like I am in a very happy relationship. I'm at a job that I like, that pays the bills, bonus. And like day by day, I'm figuring out like what I like to do as a person to make sure that I'm not holding other people to be like, well, like such and such person didn't do the dishes and therefore like my day's a mess because like now I have to do the dishes for that person when like I don't have to do the dishes for anyone, you know. But yeah, I think it's just like making decisions more so for myself and being happy there.
Yeah, no, I think that works. And also, I don't know if your mom is on this call, but in bringing up your mom, that one of my favorite parts of the entire book is your quote from your mom that starts section 3, when your mom says you should be with someone that if you said, let's go kick rocks, that person would go kick rocks with you. And I like closed at that point in reading it, I like closed the book and I was like, I love that. Like,
I do too.
Advice. But yeah, thinking about like, you don't need to label it. You don't need to worry about what other people are thinking, but just thinking like, am I content? Like you said, like content in this moment, and breathing and being okay with where this is. And I think that's like one of the biggest takeaways from your book. But on that note too, since you did bring up, we are 10 minutes past.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, all.
Yeah, no, this
Happy
is
Sunday.
But does anyone have any final questions before we end the Q&A? Or Chloe, did you have anything that you wanted to just throw out there? Like now we're ending a workshop, like final thoughts.
I guess I have a question.
Hit it.
Yeah. Hey, long time no see, Chloe. Yeah, but I really like the point you made about how sort of taking steps to mend your perfectionism can sort of even like feed into your perfectionism to some degree. And I guess like my question is sort of like, just by writing this book, do you think this has really like helped your sense of perfectionism, helped you like mend it maybe, or do you think it's like maybe fed into it? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Oh, Mike, that's such a good question. And as someone that was in our grad program, like, or just like anyone that's trying to do something, like you get that it's like to write something or create something, it's like you're pulling your hair out and it could not be more of a perfectionist experience. But this book definitely absolutely was cathartic. It was like, this is what I needed to do in order to feel better. Because I didn't realize, like I call it like, this was like my cognitive behavioral therapy in a sense, because I was just like unpacking like, wait, why do I have this expectation that I have to do this thing? And then I got to write it out in an essay and research like, oh, well, maybe like this presumption that I've been holding for so long isn't actually right. So it definitely, it brought some relief in that sense. I think like without this book, I think saved, like not to be dramatic, but I think it really did like save my life or change my life in a dramatic way where I'm like, okay, I don't have to like, and again, like as someone that writes as well, like you read a book and they're like, if you don't write at 5 a.m. every day, like, do you really want it? And you're like, oh, cool. Let me just throw that on my to-do list, is like wake up at 5 a.m. and write for 2 hours. Like that's like a fun, breezy, cool thing. And then if you miss one day, you're like, I'm a failure. And I don't walk around with that anymore, which is like really, really dope. So yeah, I think that's such a good question. Yeah, the process of doing this, even though it like did like trigger a lot of perfectionist phrases, like I went through waves where I like was writing this book and was not writing this book because I was too afraid to go back to it for 6 weeks, and then I'm like pick it back up, and like just like very highs and lows with the book itself, and obviously with like discovering all these things also within a pandemic where you're just like sitting and doing nothing but thinking and then writing about thinking. Oh my gosh, what a cycle. So yeah, I think it like it did both. It did both things. It definitely made things hard, but it also is like ultimately been a benefit. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, Chloe, I had a question.
Oh, hi, Luke.
So this is, hey, this is strange. I never thought I'd be talking to you like screen to screen in a workshop, but here we are. So when I was downloading Zoom tonight to get this meeting set up, I like went to make sure that my video works, that my audio works and everything. And I couldn't help but notice that there was a little sliding bar that said, touch up my appearance. You slide it to the right and it like changes the lighting. So I guess even Zoom wants us to look perfect. So my question for you is like, it's one thing to have, you spoke a lot about awareness. So like, it's one thing to have awareness of, we have to be exactly like the people around us. But I think an interesting thing about perfectionism is it can kind of invade your life in these ways that are harder to see, that are not necessarily coming through people as the vehicle. So like my question for you is like, what suggestions do you have for your readers to like have kind of like an extended sense of awareness and like detecting perfectionism in these different sorts of vehicles?
That's a lovely question, Lee Pinto. Did you touch up your appearance? Because you look great. You look phenomenal.
I figured I'd put it on 50% in the spirit of not being too perfectionist.
That's great. That's really good. Yeah, I think that there is so much subliminal, there's so much subliminal issues. Like obviously social media is one that I feel like we don't even have to like, it's like borderline the elephant in the room, or we can all just assume that like this is the most subconscious, like what you should be doing, what you should be wearing, what you should be buying, where you should be going. Like I feel like even I look at a lot of like food review websites where like, these are the places in New York City that you should go to. And there's a chapter as well about like living in a city and being like maximizing your 20s and making sure you're hitting all the greatest hits of a given area, like while you're young and unmarried and like checking it out. So I think that's a very good question. And it is good to like, I think just having that awareness, right? Like thinking about like, okay, do I need to turn on the filter? If the filter makes you feel better, then awesome. But are you still doing that, I guess, in a sense to impress the people around you? Again, you look great. I have no qualms. But yeah, I think that's like a very interesting question. But I definitely, when I started writing this book, just like thinking about perfectionism more or seeing the symptoms of it more, you see it everywhere. And so I think that's the other, I think, somewhat cool thing about it is that it's not like, okay, like now you know what perfectionism is and go like answer your 10 questions about who you are and unpack like your life story and like also come out of the closet. Like, I don't think that's everyone's path on this. But I think that you do get to like look at things with a second view that you might otherwise brush by and be like, okay, do I need to update my Zoom appearance? Do I need to buy the thing that Instagram is like suggesting looks so good on this skinny girl that I wish I could wear, but I can't wear like a vintage mini skirt for like $300, you know? Excuse me, yeah. So it's also like, who are you trying to impress? If you're trying to impress other people and that's making you unhappy, then like screw the Zoom filter. I hope that helps. Yeah.
I actually have a follow-up to Luke's question. And thinking about, you pointed out like one example of perfectionism and this need to strive for it. And you mentioned how it is everywhere. During the process of writing this book, did a lot of people reach out to you and show you examples? Like how has your community and friendships changed as a result of writing this book?
That is also a great question. I think it's been very, very cool to see how people reach out to me because they're like, oh, I saw this article about perfectionism, or people reach out sometimes, a few people with personal stories that I knew in different sectors, like in a Penn State involvement, or like friend from high school who's like, now that I'm thinking about perfectionism, I'm seeing how it impacts like my work. It's just, I think specifically being at the age we are in a workforce where you're sort of like potentially like in a lower rung and you're stressed about like getting hired and like moving up the ranks and also like not looking like the young fool on your team. I think work compounds that a lot for people and also school. So it's been really, I don't know. I mean, it's also funny because like if someone sees something with perfectionism, they're like, Chloe, and I'm like, I guess I'll take that. I did label myself as such, you know? So I'm open to all of those things. I do love that. To know people are thinking about me, but also people have reached out with some like wow, like now that I'm thinking about it, I do have perfectionism in like the space of my life, which has been very, 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 very cool. Cool. All right. I mean, I don't know if there's additional questions or if there were questions in the chat, Laura, that you spotted earlier, but
I didn't see any questions, but does anybody have any final things they'd like to ask Chloe while she's here?
While you have me. And if not, that's absolutely fine too.
Yes, but Chloe, I do want to say thank you on behalf of me and then everyone else. Say thank you for answering all of these questions today. If you do not already have a copy, please buy Perf. And also follow Chloe on Instagram at, I think your handle is Chloe a writer, which
yes.
Chloe is a writer. She's a published author. Buy her book. But I don't know if you want to pitch any of your other social media tags. I forget about all of like social media except for Instagram. So.
Oh no, I also think I forget about all social media. I'm trying actively to forget about social media. But you can follow me on Instagram. You can follow Laura on Instagram as well. Laura's book coming out. And I just appreciate you guys all being here and bearing through the emotional highs and lows. It's been a journey. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And I guess, Chloe, in leading us out, I'm going to ask one more thing. Could you read for us just the final paragraph of your book to end with?
Okay, cool. I can do that. I can totally do that. All right. Okay, this is the final paragraph of the book. Whenever she chooses, there is a book on a shelf sitting amongst a dozen other books on knitting or fiction writing or gardening. It will belong entirely to the person who wrote it and the person who holds it. Together, they'll grow their shelves in their minds. They will stop searching for the answers to perfect themselves. They will give up the chase towards something better and try to appreciate how good things are, even at their worst in this particular right now.
Great. Thank you, Chloe. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks, guys. Bye.